so much about my family's lucking out with the great prizes and more about education today, actually. And so I want to start with an imaginary scene. Imagine this. You hear clinking glasses of bubbly champagne, and you see waiters tentatively walking past carrying platter after food. Now you might think, okay, is this the EG? No, actually, the diners are CEOs of highly influential companies, and they're taking public servants out to dinner. They throw galas with unlimited drinks, according to some primary sources, margarita glasses as large as buckets, and they throw raffles to give away exclusive association memberships, iPods, Kindles, even laptops. They fly in high-profile speakers for these public servants' professional development retreats. So if you ask yourself where this is, I can forgive you for thinking that this is something taking place in the jaded halls of Washington, D.C., but this isn't a corporate special interest group softly lobbying your Congress members, your senators, and representatives. This is actually a scene that plays out sometime every year at education conferences around the United States, at conference after conference aimed at school district superintendents, technology specialists, principals, and even teachers. And it's not restricted to conferences either, because a lot of companies will come to school districts and woo the potential clients in their own backyards, often with the added treat of free professional development or teacher training and the use of their technology or textbook. So you might wonder how I know all this, where I get these scenarios from. Well, I'm a frequent attendee of these education conferences myself. Though I can assure you I've never been offered a margarita. As a student, I don't have a lot of purchasing power. And I typically keynote at these events, but I've also occasionally promoted products. My excuse for this is that I have to subsidize my investigative reporting. In my attendance at these conferences, as well as my experience dealing with school districts, I've learned just how many special interests, you might say, corporations, unions, even government, are at work to grab slices of the education pie. But as a student, I have to ask who's ultimately going to eat it. We need to make this education pie as tasty for our students as it seems to be to everyone else. So there's a cartoon in my social studies textbook, and it's a pretty fun one. It depicts all these European imperialist nations trying to split up China. And so you see Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm, Tsar Nicholas over there. I think that represents France, and the Japanese dude. And then there's this really stereotypical Chinese guy in the background, long fingernails and everything, throwing up his hands in alarm. So if I could take the liberty of updating this cartoon, and please forgive me, I was using Microsoft Paint, not Photoshop, and I definitely did not do this as well as the all pop art people. I should have contacted them. So while I'm not trying to equate the wheeling and dealing of the seedy educational underworld with European imperialism, I will explain exactly what facet of these, exactly what facet of the pie these faces represent. They're not necessarily villains, just special interests. And what ends up happening is that my fellow students and I, looking unfortunately very happy there, we end up being left out. So let's start with Tsar Nicholas over there on the right. So the face is that of Harold McGraw III, nice name, CEO of the McGraw-Hill Publishing Company. So the only reason I'm bringing him up is because of a recent article that I saw in the Huffington Post's education section. And it was written by this teacher named Randy Turner, who is a blogger and a teacher. And he wrote this insightful article, which I'll partially quote. I should put it up on a slide, but I was procrastinating. Seriously, last night. The ACUITY Acuity is just a tool to help determine what we need to do to excel on the annual Missouri Assessment Program tests, MAP. We interrupt regular classes 7 times a year to give these practice standardized tests, which are created by the textbook and testing company McGraw-Hill, the same outfit that publishes the MAP. In addition to the 7 tests, we take practice tests to make sure we do well on the practice tests, and we use Acuity information to determine which students should go into a guided study program, which also uses Acuity preparation materials. To make sure our schools do well on the practice tests, for the standardized tests, we aligned our curriculum to go with Acuity. So now we teach toward the practice tests, for the practice tests, for the standardized tests. Yeah, that's actually, I was not just repeating myself a lot, that was actually what the guy said. So I want to ask you, how many of you, before you have a high-stakes board meeting, let's say, have a practice for the actual meeting? It would be hard to find a real-world situation where these skills of practicing for the practice for the actual thing would come in handy. And yet these are the kinds of skills that kids learn every day while in school. Now, you might ask, well, why the heck is this going on? Is it hard to see why McGraw-Hill, making tons of money off of all their test prep materials, would like such a curriculum and push it? How is this so different from politics, where we complain about our members of Congress trying to get things that the military doesn't necessarily need? They're trying to push through orders for it because they have constituents accompanying in that area, or just for political popularity. I don't know if representatives from McGraw-Hill took school district or state officials out for dinner, but we do know that McGraw-Hill has a very cozy relationship with the Missouri curriculum that is, I'm thinking, driven by profit. The blog post went on to say, such is the state of modern education, and the success of this portion of it can be laid at the doorstep of Harold McGraw III, Chairman, President, CEO. So his total pay package totaled $9,591,916. And the teacher went on to say in the blog, while the teachers at my school, most of whom make in the neighborhood of $35,000 a year, are taking a sizable hit from high gas prices, McGraw does not have to worry about such problems. So if you compare $9 million to $35,000, it's kind of obvious why this writer might be a little angry. And these are the types of salaries that we complain about when we see them going to, I don't know, hedge fund managers, about government bailouts or something. And rarely do we think of textbook publishers. My dad just wanted to know the answer to one question, which I was able to answer. How much are the McGraw-Hill textbook writers getting in royalties? And how does that compare to their CEO's earnings? So, to stop bragging on the poor guy, I want to point out that while the CEO's yearly salary may be fairly high on the scale, and this seems like a really flagrant example, schools teaming up with companies to exclusively use that company's products and services is hardly new, because my experience at education technology conferences has shown me what often happens when companies take school district officials out for dinner. Now, to continue quoting the article, the teacher said, I can't argue with success. 2 studies have been released showing that the use of Acuity has resulted in dramatic increases in standardized tests. Of course, both of these studies were financed by McGraw-Hill, and each featured results from only one school, but who am I to argue with scientific studies? How is this different from the Food and Drug Administration, using studies funded by pharmaceutical companies? I'm familiar with an interactive whiteboard company which constantly cites all this research, and it shows that students made immediate gains in learning when they had this interactive whiteboard in their class. Great. Well, curiously, the interactive whiteboard company funded the study. And, we see all these things coming in like, I don't know, rutabagas will extend your life and stuff. They're really funded by a rutabaga growing association, obviously hypothetical. But when it comes to studies being funded by companies that will make money if you buy their stuff, then you can find it in a lot of industries. The difference is that I'm thinking most of you think that education, medicine, government, all of this is more sacred. And it should be, because it's not ultimately the superintendents or the companies, or even usually the teachers who get the raw end of the deal. It's the students who have to sit and wonder why their school bought interactive whiteboards and didn't teach the teachers how to use them, or see our orchestra or drama class struggle for money when for some reason the school just bought brand new microphones for every room. I'm not opposed to education technology. It's one of the things that I advocate when I go to conferences. I talk about, this is how it can be best used, etc. But I am opposed to companies that, sell all this technology, they dump it in a school and walk away without showing how it is best used. Now, again, to go back to my experience attending these education conferences, I know that showing off your product in the booths on the exhibit floor is only half the deal. The other half comes from giveaways, raffles to equip your library with 30 new computers, if you'll just write down your name, phone number, and school district, please. The galas with wine and cheese that extend into the night, connections exhibitors make with school district superintendents on bus rides to welcome parties at museums, and cards being handed across the bus's aisles. It's frightening to me that sometimes education company people know the names of more decision makers in my school district than I do. But in many cases, that was the reality that I saw. You might think that I'm being overly critical of companies that have to make money somehow, but it's really not limited to for-profit companies. The drive for money continues, strangely, even in the halls of government, which you would think, well, they fund education, so what the heck is going on? Well, the Department of Education at the federal level is very limited in its power. There's seriously a little booklet that was being handed out at some of these conferences that said, this is all the stuff we can't do, which was pretty incredible. But it can offer 2 things to schools, the carrot or the stick. We saw the stick in No Child Left Behind, taking money away from schools which weren't performing well on tests, and then the carrot in Race to the Top and other initiatives. It's like, I'll give you money if you do well. So technology grants come to purchasing technology, and school districts and states pitted out against each other to get more money from the federal government and also more money per student. And most people don't know that for every student that a school gets, they get a certain amount of money, and it depends on how many courses you'll take. But I found this out kind of the hard way. So I go to an online public school called Washington Virtual Academy, or WAVA. Funding for them comes from the Monroe School District. I'm currently in my second semester of 9th grade. And last semester I thought, okay, I'm going to take cooking and drama at my local school, Redmond Junior High. So I took those 2 electives, but a different kind of drama would soon erupt. Because as it turned out, I was over my course limit. You see, the amount of money that a school gets from the school district or from the government or whatever is from the number of classes that you take, and in that case, I was over the limit. I could only take 1 year-long elective through Redmond Junior High, or 2 semester-long ones over 2 semesters, but not 2 semester-long ones in 1 semester. So I was told to drop a class and take it next semester. But I had already enrolled in it, and so it was a bit of a pain. My mom called up the school districts and lectured them. She said, education rules should be made to help students advance and reach their full potential. And they told her, well, it's because it's about the money. The number of courses a student takes determines how much money they get. Neither district wanted to give me the extra course because they wouldn't get that extra money. And I thought that this whole obsession with I need to get this money for this hour that so-and-so has their butt in the chair in the classroom was a little ironic for a system that we call public education and free. Eventually we made enough of a ruckus online that the curriculum provider for my online school found out and it was solved, and I was allowed to take French online despite the fact that they weren't receiving money for the enrollment, which was very kind of them. And I finished the classes with all A's. But this experience taught me that in too many cases, education is not about letting kids reach their full potential, as school districts often have as their slogans. It's often about money. And in my experience, I saw these 2 school districts squabbling like estranged siblings, trying to get a bigger share of their parents' money. And I just thought it was disgraceful for education management to be this way. So originally you've watched the documentary film Waiting for Superman. I see some raised hands, it was very popular. So the difficulty of firing teachers was one of the things that was featured very predominantly in the film. So you had all these teachers who were just sitting in a room in order to collect a paycheck for work they weren't doing because they were grossly negligent, but they were too difficult to fire. And this is obviously ridiculous, and that has to end. But on the other hand, I'm a teacher as well as a student. And I'm not a fan of the recent drive to fire teachers based on what can be somewhat subjective evaluation processes. Certainly every student in the classroom ought to be able to do reading, writing, and arithmetic competently. But test scores are not the best way to evaluate good or bad teaching, or even good or bad learning, or real learning. Tests can be badly written, their standards vary from state to state, hugely, and by making test scores the cornerstone of teacher evaluation, we run the risk of further narrowing our curriculum. So the teachers feel pressured to become little more than test prep tutors, endlessly drilling the same facts over and over again because if your paycheck, or whether you're going to get fired or whatever is tied to how well your student does on a test, you're going to be like them, choose A, choose B, choose C, but that's not the best way of learning. Knowing how to create a documentary film, teach your fellow students, or even put yourself into a classical painting, these are not skills that are going to come up on your state test, but are they interesting and or useful? Definitely. I want you to all take a moment to think back to your best teachers. Who do you think of when you think of a really awesome teacher? Was it a cool science teacher? Was it your really creative language teacher? Whoever it was, it could even be a mentor outside of school. Were your best teachers the ones who drilled you for tests repeatedly, only teaching what would be tested, and ensuring that you had memorized the needed information extremely well? Or were they the ones who instilled a love of learning in you? There's a very memorable passage from Time magazine which quotes the former Washington, D.C. Chancellor of Schools, Michelle Rhee, and she said, and it started with a quote, "People say, well, test scores don't take into account creativity and the love of learning. I'm like, you know what, I don't give a crap. Don't get me wrong, creativity is good and whatever, but if the children don't know how to read, I don't care how creative you are. You're not doing your job." I strongly believe that every child should know how to read and write. But I also believe that creativity is as important as literacy. I look at it this way. I wouldn't be able to read my favorite poems if I weren't literate, but my favorite poems wouldn't exist at all if someone wasn't creative. These two things work beautifully together, but too often they're treated like things on a checklist. Number one, you know how to do this. Number two, you can be creative. They come one after another. But in my case, creativity and imagination really drove me to be literate. I wanted to read and write so that I could follow the newest bug inspector story and write long, fanciful novels of my own about escapes through floorboards out to sea. And all I can say is that I wouldn't have been nearly so enthusiastic about writing and reading and eventually publishing my books if I had been told to do handwriting practice or write stale book reports. I mean, these are the things which you often get in school. Our really creative people, our problem solvers, the type of people who come to the EG, are the people who drew cartoons on the sides of their book reports and animated them with flip books, or the people who decide to write their own novels, create their own storyboards, and animate them, not just read other people's stories or watch others' movies. Another thing which Rees' quote overlooks is the fact that by denying the sector of students who are illiterate the chance to be creative, you're denying them maybe their last motivation to be literate. Why do I want to know how to read and write if it only means that I have to answer a bunch of dumb worksheet questions anyway? I want to be able to write songs and posters and speeches, not learn how to fill in bubbles on a state exam. Simply because I'm poor and I don't read at grade level doesn't mean I don't appreciate the chance to be creative. I might use that as my impetus to improve. If I were a student in a poor urban neighborhood with a relatively bad school, I would ask, why should the rich suburban kids, who had every benefit from the start of life, their parents taught them how to read and write, brought them on museum trips, why should they be able to study modernist poetry and have mock trials for historical figures while we have expectations preset for us, getting placed in vocational courses and test-driven prep classes instead of being allowed to utilize the skills which may eventually launch us to higher levels in society? Utilizing your creativity in school shouldn't be treated as a privilege only allotted to a certain class of students. Yet this problem of certain levels of education becoming increasingly elite isn't just restricted to kids in poorer socioeconomic areas. In general, we see a lot of curriculum narrowing across the board. This drive to get back down to the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. And this leads to the shortening or squeezing out entirely of many of the so-called non-essential classes, like creative writing, drama, painting, music. And in combination with our lack of exercise, this situation leads to, as EG attendee and composer Philip Shepard brilliantly put it, I'm sorry I didn't tell you I was going to quote you on this, but a generation of fat, unmusical children. I was seeing this image in my mind, I think, uh-oh, I don't play an instrument and I need to exercise more, otherwise I'm going to turn nervous. But many of you are probably here today because you had teachers, mentors, family members who told you it's okay to be creative. You don't always have to just follow the rules and draw within the box and do all this stuff. You can make flip books and that's awesome. And you were allowed to see through whatever creative endeavors you took on that learning is about more than problems, dates, and facts. Learning is lifelong at the center of everything we do, whether it's cartooning or composing, creative writing, or construction. And that's why we all need to care about education. I don't care whether you have kids or not. The students going into school tomorrow, the students going into school today will be possibly tomorrow's EG attendees. If you want high-quality attendees at the EG 20 years from now, 30 years from now, by which time I'm assuming that you won't have given it up, although I know it's challenging. But if you want high-quality EG attendees, you have a vested interest in improving education today. Because today's students are tomorrow's writers, producers, reporters, mathematicians, doctors, lawyers, architects, leaders, or convicts. You can't take an insular approach because what happens in school may stay in school for a couple of years, but then it comes out sooner or later. So, obviously, for good reason, there's been all this talk about education change and reform, but in general, it's been adults doing the talking. This is true for education in general. Think back to your own learning experience. How many of you sat on your school district's board of trustees or regularly asked to testify about your learning experience and how you thought your school could be better improved? Did your teachers ask you to tell them about what they could improve? Were you regularly allowed to lead change? For some reason, a lot of adults overlook their most important resource, the students who go to class and sit in school every day. You'd think that at education conferences, like the ones I go to, discussing students and our future, students like me would be a large attendance group. This is not the case. I'm often the only student present. One time I tried to walk into an exhibit hall and I was about to walk up to the double doors and the security guard stepped in front of me and said, "Sterling, kids aren't allowed in this exhibit." The problem was that the conference hadn't purchased insurance for the liability that kids present. And this was at a conference discussing public education. So imagine for a second that you're about to enter this theater when you're stopped by one of the volunteers and said, "Sorry, we refuse entrance to all kinds of entertainers, magicians, actors and actresses, painters, because we didn't purchase the right kind of insurance for the liability that you present." If you're an entertainer's manager or agent, however, no problem, come right on in. I know how risky it is. I know how risky it is having entertainers at the EG. I mean, I know that the atmosphere in this room, there's like people who are going to kill each other right now. But this is when it comes down to it, a conference about entertainment, about ideas and stories and information pertaining to youth. And likewise, an education conference is a place where a lot of information will be shared and decisions made about education, which directly affects us, the students, and yet we're not there. As it seems with most things, Canada is ahead of us on the student voice issue. In Ontario, the new project is starting where students meet with adult decision makers and share their views on school and how it could be improved, so take a quick look.
Something is going on.
It's massive.
Oh, this could be huge.
It's humongous. I mean,
It's real change.
C'est une expérience bien spéciale.
There's a movement of change in Ontario education, and it's being led by students. And that movement is Speak Up.
It's students speaking up about what they want change in education. Not what the ministry wants, but what the students want.
They're seeing
So we're a country that has had many rights movements, declaring independence from the British, civil rights for African Americans, women's rights, animal rights. And already this movement is starting for education to become a right, not a privilege, not only in this nation, but around the world. As we continue this discussion on this movement, I want to echo what Abigail Adams said in 1776 in a famous letter, which you've probably heard 1,000 times. She wrote to John Adams, referencing the newly independent United States, "I long to hear that you have declared an independence. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws if we have no voice or representation." I'm going to leave it up to you to insert students there. We've already started the education movement. Now our task is to give students an equal share of this pie. Right now, our education system is like a movie with too many stars. Companies, unions, and governments are all trying to be main characters, when they should really be supporting roles. These organizations can be incredible partners in education reform. But in the drive to change our schools, I hope that you won't just put complete and unlimited power in the hands of adults. Give us voice and representation, and always remember the students. Thank you.